This is the day that has been given to us. Rather than creating it, rather than earning it or deserving it, we receive this day as a gift from the universe, a gift from God, a gift from life itself. As we gather today online and in person, let us receive the gift of this day and make of it a time to recommit to our highest ideals and our deepest commitments. In our freely covenanted faith of Unitarian Universalism, we know that it is the shared commitments of our covenant, not any creed or belief, that bind us together in beloved community and inspire us to faithful service. So as we enter our time of worship together this day at the Birmingham Unitarian Church, let us join in giving voice to the promise of this congregation's covenant. As part of the beloved BUC community, I promise to strive to be my best self in all my interactions, even the best intentions of everyone's actions, be mindful of our shared humanity in communications, pause, reflect, and be part of the solution when things go awry. Thus do we covenant with one another.
My friends gathered here in the sanctuary, look outside. This is a good morning. My friends at home, run to the nearest window, throw open the curtains. This is a good morning. My friends watching this later, sometime later in the day, take my word for it. This is a good morning. Good morning, Birmingham Unitarian Church.
Good morning.
It is good to be together again. Whether you are joining us here in the sanctuary remotely via Zoom or watching this recording later, it is good to connect with you. As a multi-platform church, it is important for us to build a bridge between online and in-person participants. We call this connection opportunity greeting our virtual neighborhoods. Now, most of you know the drill here, but let me go through it just in case you're new. We're going to have our friends at home projected up on the screen, and we're going to ask them to turn on their cameras and give us a wave. And now, we here in the sanctuary are going to turn and look at that black camera mounted on the wall and give our friends at home a wave. If you are visiting for the first time, welcome. We're glad you're here. If you are with us in the sanctuary, we invite you to join us after service for coffee and conversation in our social hall, which is located to the left as you exit the sanctuary. If you are with us on Zoom, we invite you to stay on the call for a virtual coffee hour immediately after service ends. Whenever and however we connect with BUC, we are building BUC. At home, on campus, in the world every day, we are Birmingham Unitarian Church, and we are building this community that we love. The words for our chalice lighting this morning are by Katie Silvani Gelfand, called "The End is the Beginning." We call forth the life of our faith by igniting our chalice. This spark of new beginnings invites us into a sacred space to reflect where we have been and where we are going. Even knowing that this particular flame will intentionally end with our ritual extinguishing, we fear not its end, for we know, with brave hearts, that from every ending of our lives, we are sent forth to make a new beginning.
Good morning, everyone. Our beginning hymn is number 145, As Tranquil Streams. Please stand and join us in singing if you're willing and able. As tranquil streams that meet and merge and flow as one to seek the sea, our kindred hearts and minds unite to build a church that shall be free. Free from the bonds that bind the mind to thorough thought and lifeless creed. Free from a social burden feels to serve the cause of humankind. Of freedom that is the past, but trust the dawning future more. And is the soul in search of truth and venture boldly and explore. Prophetic charge of future waits your liberating ministry. Go forward in the power of love, proclaim a truth that makes us free.
The story that I'm going to share for today is about a time when a group of Unitarian Universalists had to make a difficult decision together and needed to listen to each other. Unitarian Universalism is a living faith. We think that people should be free to believe what they must believe, the truth of their life experiences, instead of professing a belief in what they are told to believe. This is what we mean when we say ours is a creedless religion. Being a living faith means that any one of us can change what we believe if we experience a deeper truth that contradicts our previous beliefs. But in order to change, you have to be open to new thoughts, new ideas, and new experiences. You have to have your ears open to hear the experiences of the people with whom you are in community. There is a saying that people were created with 2 ears and 1 mouth, because we should listen twice as much as we speak. When we come together in community, we have the opportunity to listen to each other and gain a perspective greater than what we would have alone. Oftentimes, we listen with our ears. When you are part of a sacred, beloved community, you listen not only with your ears, but with your heart. A listening heart has the power to help us be better people. In 1948, most congregations and houses of worship in the United States were segregated or separated by the color of members' skin. Some were segregated by law, others by custom, or by a lack of actively trying to welcome and include all people. The First Unitarian Society of Chicago was one of these congregations. Although their church was located in a neighborhood with many African Americans, only whites could join, according to the written bylaws or rules of the church, and according to custom. The day came that many members began to believe they needed to take action against racism if they really wanted to live their values and principles. The minister, the Reverend Leslie Pennington, was ready for this day and was ready to take action. So was James Luther Adams. Dr. James Luther Adams was a famous liberal theologian and social ethicist, a person who studies religion, beliefs, and values. Dr. Adams taught at the Meadville Lombard Theological School, right across the street from the First Unitarian Society of Chicago. And he was a member of the congregation's board of directors, so he was a leader in the congregation. Along with some others, Reverend Pennington and James Luther Adams proposed a change in the church's bylaws to desegregate the church and welcome people whatever the color of their skin. They wanted to include, not exclude. They saw this as a way to put their love into action. When the congregation's board of directors considered the desegregation proposal, most of them supported it. However, one member of the board objected. "Your new program is making desegregation into a creed," he said. "You are asking everyone in our church to say that they believe desegregating or inviting, even recruiting people of color to attend church here is a good way to tackle racism. What if some members don't believe this?" Desegregation was a very controversial topic. In 1948, anything about skin color and racism was controversial. Some people, even some who supported African Americans in demanding their civil liberties, believed in a separate but equal policy, which kept people apart based on their skin color. Respectful debate ensued at the First Unitarian Society of Chicago. Both sides felt in their hearts that their belief was right. Perhaps they were so busy trying to be heard that they forgot to listen. And so they kept on talking. The debate went on in the board of directors meeting until the early hours of the morning. Everyone was exhausted and frustrated. Finally, James Luther Adams remembered that we should be listening twice as much as talking. He asked the person who had voiced the strongest objection, "What do you say the purpose is of this church?" Suddenly, everyone was listening. Everyone wanted to hear the answer to this crucial question. Probably the person who objected was listening especially hard to his own heart, as well as to the words he had heard from other board members through the long discussion. The board member who opposed opening the church to people of color finally replied, "Okay, Jim, the purpose of this church is to get a hold of people like me and change them." After that, the First Unitarian Society of Chicago successfully desegregated. There are things that you know, and there are things that I know. When we are together and listening to each other with ears and hearts, we know more. At this time, we'll have our children and youth join their adult facilitators at the back of the sanctuary and head off to our Baker space in Hodas Hall.
The mission of Birmingham Unitarian Church is to be a free and welcoming religious community that encourages lives of integrity, learning, service, and joy. One way we live out this mission is by giving half of our weekly offering to a nonprofit organization that shares our values and addresses needs in one of these areas: environmental action, economic justice, civic engagement, and racial justice. We support a new organization each month. Our April recipient is Transportation Riders United, which was formed in 2001 to improve transportation access and mobility in Metro Detroit. They work with a diverse group of people, including minorities, the disabled, seniors, and business owners. Top priorities are to support effective expansion of service throughout Oakland County, stop the crisis of no-show buses by ensuring local bus agencies pay competitive wages, boost state investment in transit improvement, and ensure climate change is an important factor in transportation decision-making. Let there be an offering in support of our beloved community and organizations that build the world we dream about. This morning's offering will now be received with gratitude. Ushers, please come forward. We are a church of open minds, loving hearts, and helping hands. With gratitude, we dedicate this offering to the good works of our congregation and dedicate ourselves to its service.
And as we join together in worship, we understand that putting our spiritual beliefs into practice is an important way to connect with what is of highest value for us. And we know that we can and benefit from doing so in multiple ways, both individually and collectively. We start with a collective practice of sharing with one another joys and sorrows that we may hold close to our hearts. I'll begin with a joy from the BUC Auction Committee, who expresses a blue boat full of joy. For all those who participated in last night's event, the church grossed nearly $20,000 in revenue. And yes. And our beloved community will experience a multitude of connections to be made as people carry out the events and the activities that were donated. They offer thanks to all donors, bidders, partygoers, and most importantly, volunteers. And while we try to limit spoken announcements, I will note that since we already invited you to Hodis Hall right after worship, look around for opportunities to stay involved in the auction there. We also have sorrows and apologies that there actually were two last week submitted online that were missed. We share them now. One is about Stephanie Greer, who broke her hip and is in McLaren Macomb. The other is from Suki Darlington, who notes actually sorrow and joy, the sorrow that her 14-year-old sweet, affectionate companion died from liver failure last month. Fortunately, she adds, I was surrounded by loving community through her dying, and adds the joy, the surprise, and relief to welcome an 8-year-old sweet Havanese rescue into her home, and to welcome family who visited from Minnesota and Washington, D.C. In all the sorrows and all the joys of our lives, those we express and those we have not yet shared, may we be present with one another in this, our beloved community of care and of support. We are including this year in our spiritual practices an embodied practice, because it's been shown that the pressure and stress of the past several years has impacted our bodies and our behavior. We faced a lot of trauma. We faced accelerated levels of change without enough opportunity to process or integrate what we've experienced. We've added this element to our worship services in an effort to use mind-body integration to help us feel centered, feel grounded. So at this time, be you in the sanctuary or at home, I invite you to close your eyes or soften your gaze as you feel comfortable, and to imagine. Imagine there is a comforting stream of light coming from above you and moving to and then through the top of your head. And I invite you to feel this light make its way down your face, down the back of your neck. Notice it on your shoulders as it flows down your chest, arms and torso, and gradually on down your legs, all the way to your feet. And allow this light to flow slowly through your body to wherever you are holding tension. When this light finds the place of tension, imagine it warming the tight muscles. Imagine it allowing them to release. Feel the blood come back to that area of your body. Feel the warmth. Feel the healing. Breathe slowly and deeply, feeling and embracing the relief that this healing light brings. And let us now enter a time of deeper sharing as we prepare to hear prayerful words, these written by the Reverend Sarah Lawal. I invite you to find yourself reaching deep within, reaching far beyond yourself to connect with what you know as sacred. Spirit of life and of love, God known in so many ways and mystery beyond all knowing, in the silence, in the stillness, we hear the call of our own heart, its tender dreams, its sorrows, and its triumphs. In the silence, in the stillness, we hear whispers of days gone by, of dreams still becoming, the promise of the future. We celebrate together our individual journeys and dreams and our collective ones, knowing the journey is so much richer with others to share in it. In the name of all that is holy, we pray. Blessed may we all be. Amen. I invite you to join me now in a moment of silence.
The first reading this morning is by the early 20th century theologian and minister in the Universalist Church of America, Reverend Dr. Clarence Skinner. It comes from his book, A Religion for Greatness, published in 1945. He writes, "Religion today faces a world not merely of transition, but of one revolutionary crisis following another, almost unbelievably rapidly. Political breakdown, economic paralysis, continental shifting of imperial power stun the mind and spread disease. Our atomic functions have not adjusted to the long view. The demands of the body are impatient and authentic. In view of this fact, religion is in somewhat the position of the physician at the bedside of the despairing patient, or of the social worker in a group of hungry and bewildered refugees. Undoubtedly, religion, like medicine, social work, and other institutional endeavors, must bend itself to the task of alleviating the suffering of now. Both religion and the world, however, are called to something more basic. That's the task of material alleviation and the binding of wounds. In the view of the widespread tragedy of our day and generation, religion has a basic task to perform. It calls us to a searching of heart, a painful search, which will perchance reveal ourselves to ourselves as we recreate a great heritage. We are all called on to face anew elemental truths and to ask ourselves whether we have been wise and good stewards of these priceless treasures.
Our next reading comes from an article written in 2021 by the sociologist of religion, Josh Packard. It was published in an online magazine, Religion Dispatches. He writes, "Today's young people tend to forego a single intact religious tradition in favor of a mix of sources from various traditions, religious and otherwise, to form and inform their beliefs and practices. For many young people, these scholars include the philosophies of activists, clergy, scholars, and others who have fought for the causes they're passionate about, with figures like Kimberly Crenshaw, Sylvia Rivera, Greta Thunberg, and Brian Stevenson informing their beliefs as much as prayer or scripture. We can conclude that fighting for the disenfranchised is not merely adjacent to Gen Z's beliefs and values, rather, being informed and actionable about social justice is now core to what they consider to be moral or faithful. With this in mind, we can expect that any religious group, or frankly, any institution, that fails to pursue or support productive steps towards LGBTQ rights, gender equity, immigration rights, racial justice, etc., will continue to have trouble appealing to Gen Z and gaining their trust." Prophetic church, the future waits your liberating ministry. We sang that line together earlier this morning. And it comes from a hymn that, when you hear that line out of context, let me put it this way. You might wonder, wow, that sounds pretty woke. Who was the social justice activist who wrote that one? As it turns out, that hymn was written in the year 1933. Interesting how times change and don't change. The author of it, Reverend Marion Ham, was serving as a minister of a Unitarian church in Massachusetts at the time. And he wrote it for one of the first joint projects that the Unitarians and the Universalists undertook together on a national scale. They published a joint hymnal the next year after that hymn was written. And those of you who have been UUs for decades, you might remember the red hymnal. Most of us, it was before our time, but I suspect a couple of you will recall it. That's the hymnal we're referring to. I believe its title is Hymns of the Spirit. And that hymn became important in our history in another way almost 30 years later, when the Universalists and the Unitarians formally consolidated together in 1961 to form the Unitarian Universalist Association that this church is a member of today. At the ceremony to mark the consolidation, or the merger as we sometimes call it, as soon as the agreement was formally signed, the first song that they sang together was the song we sang as our first hymn today. It plays an important role in our history, and it marks ways in which our faith has changed over the years and decades. And I want to add here a note of appreciation to our pianist, Myra Walker, not only for the excellent playing we're used to, thank you, but particularly today for choosing as instrumental pieces compositions that were composed by Unitarian Universalists, Bela Bartok and Edward Grieg. But the hymn we began with and its rich origin story give us just one example of how throughout its long history our faith has always been one that's changing. And indeed, I'd argue that the Universalists and the Unitarians and the Unitarian Universalists, I mean, we may not always get it right, but overall, I think we have largely been more successful than many other faith traditions in embracing changing times. Which is why that article that we heard for the second reading may sound like, and I think in some ways is, good news for us UUs. Now, the article that the reading was drawn from has a long title, but it's a very telling title. Gen Z is turning away from religion in order to live out their values. That makes the point clear. And it's a reminder that the times are indeed changing. So as we think about the future of our faith, and I've said to a few people before today that when I was telling them that that was the title of today's sermon, I added pretty much universally, not that it's an ambitious title at all, but as we're thinking about what the future of our faith may evolve into, I think it behooves us to pay attention to some of these changes that are happening around us, as well as those that we may expect within our ranks. And in fact, there was a report published about 4 years ago by the UUA that in one portion of it noted some of these changes, and here's a couple quotes from it. Our nation is moving away from institutional religion. Unitarian Universalism is not immune. We too are losing congregations and have many teetering on the edge of collapse. While we typically refer to 1,000 congregations, In truth, we now have 819 congregations that would meet the standard to become a congregation today. And please note those words were written a few months before the beginning of the COVID pandemic. The numbers have certainly changed since then. And they add, as institutional religion declines, more who enter our doors are not refugees from other faiths, but are experiencing faith communities for the first time through our faith and are seeking spiritual ground, which has real implications for what we might expect from visitors and newcomers to our church. And one final quote from this report: the demographics of our nation have changed, and with them expectations around cultural competency. And that speaks to what we heard in the second reading as well, the expectations of younger generations. These are important truths for us to grapple with. And I think they are both good news and hard news for us, because while we have an openness to change that is not found in every religious congregation or tradition, we all know that change is hard. And some of the changes that might be required of us to meet these changing times may feel uncomfortable at times. But that's not new for us. Indeed, it's been true for so much of our history. And here I think of that first reading by Clarence Skinner, that great universalist theologian of the early and mid-20th century, wrote those words at the end of World War II, but many of the themes are just as relevant today. He wrote political breakdown, economic paralysis, continental shifting of imperial power. These stun the mind and spread disease. How relevant is that? And he adds, religion calls us to a searching of heart, a painful search that will perchance reveal ourselves to ourselves. And there is great wisdom in that, which is occasionally uncomfortable, but it reminds us of the importance of self-reflection and self-awareness, both individually and collectively as congregations. And also for our UU movement writ large. Because indeed, in current day UUism, that search is underway. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I need to briefly note for those who won't be familiar, there was quite a controversy in national UU circles about 7 years ago. In fact, it's come to be known as the white supremacy controversy. The triggering event was the announcement that a new lead staff member for one of the regions of the UUA had been announced, and it was, yet again, another white minister, as at that time they all were. And a couple of people, whether appropriately or inappropriately, we can decide later, voiced concerns about this over social media. And that grew into a firestorm, the likes of which I'd never seen before in national UU circles, that became so contentious that less than 2 months later, the president of the UUA had resigned, as had 2 senior staff members, and the president of the UU Ministers Association as well. And that controversy triggered a searching about ways in which it might be the case that tendencies towards white supremacy, and no, I don't speak of that virulent kind of white supremacy that some of us associate that term with, of those who wear white hoods. But I mean the more insidious and subtle ways in which things happen in our culture and our traditions that continue to privilege white people above people of color and treat those of us who are white as in some ways better. One of the outcomes of that search was the report I quoted from 4 years ago. That came out 4 years ago. It was entitled Widening the Circle of Concern. It was a dramatic report. If you've not seen it, I invite you to search for it online. You can find the text online, and it's available in print. It had the misfortune, purely for reasons beyond their control, of being published in February of 2020. And what happened the next month? Yeah. And as a result, while it started gaining some real attention, we were all distracted. And maybe it didn't gain as much attention as it could have. And I'd argue that this controversy has played into one piece of the reasoning behind, not the entire reasoning behind, but is one of the reasons for reconsidering Article 2 of the UUA bylaws, which currently contains our historical 7 principles, at least historical to the mid-1980s when they were approved, and the 6 sources of Unitarian Universalism. And as many of you know, there is a proposed revision, a significant revision, and shifting from principles and sources to values and covenant. And while many of the same phrases are contained in the new draft, they're considerably restructured. And that's controversial, as many of you know, because this congregation last year voted pretty significantly against those changes to Article 2. I'll say one other thing later about Article 2, but that's not the primary focus of my sermon today. I more want to lift up aspects of these broader changes that are playing out in UU circles. And one of them is a shift, a pretty profound theological shift that's occurring in UUism today. And I think it parallels the broader shift in our religious culture that I described earlier, that we heard about in the second reading. And it has real implications for the core commitments of our faith, for how we articulate them and how we live them out. Our approach to religion has historically been associated with a broad school of theological thought known as liberal theology, which is not necessarily the same as political liberalism, though there is some overlap, but rather it is, to quote one scholar, attempts to reconceptualize the meaning of traditional Christian teaching, and this was a Christian writer, in the light of modern knowledge and modern ethical values. And he adds, it is not revolutionary, but reformist in spirit and substance. The writer was Gary Dorian. He's an Episcopal priest and theologian, but a number of Unitarian Universalists studied under him. And a source as widely regarded as Encyclopedia Britannica also described liberal theology in this way. It emphasizes confidence in human reason, primacy of the person, or the individual, immanence of God, or we might say in a UU context, the idea that the holy or the sacred is not distant from the world, and, to continue the quote, the belief that human nature is improvable and improving. So this is an approach to religious meaning that tends towards lofty ideals like freedom, reason, tolerance. Indeed, those three have been historically associated with the Unitarian side of our heritage. And it's an approach which we have embraced in various ways since its very beginning some 200 years ago. It was certainly good for its time. For a portion of that, it was ahead of its time. And the context has changed in recent years in ways that liberal theology doesn't necessarily meet in quite the same ways as it used to. And one of the things that has emerged has been a new approach, which is broadly known as liberation theology. And this is, to quote another religion scholar, Anthony Bradley, a theology applied to the core concerns of marginalized communities in need of social, political, or economic equality and justice. And the term is historically associated with Latin American theologians starting some 50, 60 years ago to lift up an understanding of their faith that's meaningful for the poor and the oppressed in those countries. And it's also been embraced by black theology, by feminist theology, more recently by queer theology. It does have some overlap with liberal theology. They are not radically opposed to one another. In fact, I'd argue that the person in the United States who was the most effective at bringing nascent themes of liberation theology into a liberal theological context was Martin Luther King Jr., who identified clearly as a theological liberal, especially in his younger years, but also clearly lifted up concerns for the marginalized community of African Americans. And one of the key differences between liberation theology and liberal theology is that rather than being abstract and lofty in the way liberal theology sometimes could, liberation theology is contextual. It takes seriously the context of the poor in Latin America, black people in the US, LGBTQ people, women. You get the point. And that report, Widening the Circle of Concern, actually addressed this theological shift. They put it this way in one of their recommendations: reinterpretation of our theological legacies in these times should be liberatory and articulate our commitment to affirming and welcoming those who've been marginalized in our larger societies and within communities and organizations. Now, I know this sounds to some like a change that they object to. And if that's your response, if your response is to think I'm advocating for a change that you personally, or perhaps this congregation, would never accept, well, I'll respectfully push back that it looks to me like you already have accepted it. The eighth principle, quote, journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and in our institutions. Many of you know there's been a grassroots movement in the last few years to add this eighth principle to the 7 principles that have been in place since the mid-1980s. And this is, frankly, the most popular brief expression of liberation theology that I know of in Unitarian Universalist circles. And this congregation voted overwhelmingly to adopt it as one of your core principles just under 2 years ago. And yet, I must admit, I'm puzzled by one thing. Article 2, the proposed revisions to Article 2 were voted down here just a year later. Now, some who voted it down had other reasons for voting against it that a few of you shared with me. I absolutely get that. But I've also heard 1 or 2 reports, admittedly secondhand, of at least a few people here voting against the Article 2 revisions because they contain language like that in the 8th principle. And that's not a coincidence. One of the people on the task force who wrote the proposal for Article 2 is in fact the person who first started promoting the 8th principle, Paula Cole-Jones, a lay leader at All Souls Unitarian in Washington, D.C. So I got to admit, the contrast in popularity here between the 8th principle and the proposed Article 2 revisions surprises me a bit. I'd be interested to hear more from you about that, but we can discuss that more later. One of the reasons I'm raising this is to note the importance of our UU faith and ministry meeting our context. Whatever else you may say about liberation theology, I do appreciate that it takes context seriously. So if we're shifting from being a traditionally liberal religion to being a liberationist faith, or perhaps an amalgam of both, then what does the future of our faith look like? Well, frankly, I see two broad options, one negative and one positive. And if these sound familiar, some of you will remember me saying something similar, specific to this congregation in a town hall last month. But the negative option is that we fail to live into our new context. We fail to live into these changing times. We resist the changes in ways that lead us to become increasingly irrelevant. Because as more people come in our doors, younger people especially, and people of color, queer people, etc., and find a mismatch between their needs and what they're hearing from this congregation, or any other congregation. I'm not singling UUC out here. They're all the more likely not to stay around or not to come back, which will mean that we'll be increasingly unsuccessful at retaining those who visit or explore our church, and that's gradually going to cause us to dwindle in vibrancy, in communal health, in resources, and in size. But that's just one of the two options. The more positive one is that we'll meet these changing times, that will be increasingly affirming of the needs and the leadership of people of color, of queer and trans people, of people with different abilities, neurodiversities, and, yes, I say this as a cisgender white man in my 50s, young adults, those much younger than me. To the extent that we extend a culture of authentic welcome, the kind of welcome that gently but clearly resists microaggressions, in other ways that we might subtly privilege the status quo, usually without intending to, and then live true to our proclaimed values within and beyond our walls. That's what I think is more likely to make us successful in the future. In other words, for us UUs, it's important for us to be who we say we are and do as we say we do. Because here's the thing. The practices I'm laying out here are practices that have been true to how most UUs I know understand their faith, for the entire 3 decades that I've been Unitarian Universalist. And that's been understood for decades. That's why those words written 91 years ago that I quoted at the start of this sermon sound just as fresh today. It's not a new way of being UU. It's more a renewed emphasis on certain aspects of Unitarian Universalism that already are part of who we are as a people of faith. So to the extent that we can offer the authentic hospitality that welcomes in the stranger as they would seek to be welcomed, that lives fully into our articulated covenant, our mutually agreed on promises about our relationships, and how to invite people back to those promises when they fall short, as we humans so often fall short, and embody our work for justice, to advocate for our values beyond our walls, and equally to work for them within our walls. The more we can do that, the more we can live into this changing times, and I suspect increasingly, our changing faith. I'll end with one note about what's about to happen. I said something at the beginning about our opening hymn. As it happens, there's a not dissimilar history to the final hymn that we're about to sing. This one was written in the 1950s. Now, the hymn tune will be familiar to many of you, but the words were written a few years before the overall consolidation of the Unitarians and the Universalists by youth who joined their organizations. The Unitarian Youth Group and the Universalist Youth Group merged in the mid-1950s, several years ahead of the larger denominational bodies, to create liberal religious youth, which again, a few of you who have been UUs for many decades will remember that organization. I think this is a good opportunity to lift up our history of embracing change and embracing the future as we sing together. So may it be for us all.
Would you join with me and stand if you're willing and able to sing "We Would Be One"?
We would be one, as now we join in singing. I am of love to pledge ourselves anew to that high cause of greater understanding of who we are and what in us is true. We would be one in living for each other, to show to all a new community. We would be one in building for tomorrow a nobler world than we have known today. We would be one towards searching for God's meaning, which binds our hearts and points us on our way. And when we pledge ourselves to greater service, with love and justice, strive to make us free.
So as we leave this sacred time, leave the many sacred places where we have gathered, may we carry with us the gifts of gratitude for the nurturing of our spirits and community, humility when we fall short of our highest aspirations, and resilience to strengthen our resolve. With these, may we go forth to serve this hurting world in the spirit of love. Go in peace.